My name is Charlene Margot. I am the proud co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture, and we would like to welcome tonight's featured presenter, Deborah Farmer Kris. Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you so much, Charlene, and welcome everybody. So tonight, I'm going to talk about a subject that was off my radar screen until about this time last year. I was going through a bit of a writer's block, or perhaps even a writer's fatigue last year at about this time, because for 18 months, I had been working at very fast speeds with PBS and other places to be trying to fill the parent education need. And it felt like all my articles were about stress, anxiety, resilience, helping kids deal with transitions, deal with grief. And I was exhausted. I felt a little bit like this child holding up a boulder. And I think as parents, I'm going to guess 99% of us felt like this too, that we were just trying to keep the boulder from crushing us and crushing our family. About the same time, I was working on the end pages of one of my picture books, You Wonder All the Time, the letter to parents in the back. And I decided to dive a little more deeply into some of the research on wonder and awe. Most of this research from the last 15 years comes out of the Greater Good Science Center from UC Berkeley. And as I began to step into this research, I found myself getting really excited. It was a shot in the arm that I needed. And then as I interviewed some of the principal researchers and read everything I could find on this research, I realized that I was reading something that fundamentally was beginning to shift the way I was approaching my relationship with myself and my kids. And so I'm so excited to share with you tonight some of what I have learned about an emotion called awe. Now, first, I just want to note that awe is an emotion. And one of my favorite terms about emotions, because I really think of myself as an emotion scientist, this emotions in kids is really my jam. And there's this fantastic term called emotional granularity, and was coined by Lisa Feldman Barrett from Northeastern University. And basically, it's the ability to put into words with high degree of specificity what we are feeling. So are we feeling mad, or are we irate? Are we annoyed? Are we confused? Are we frustrated? And if we can speak more granularly about what we are feeling and notice and put into words, it has all kinds of psychological benefits. So I keep one of these wheels in my house, and I keep it in, take it into classrooms. This is an emotions wheel. You can find many of them online, different places. And, your core basic emotions for your, pre-K student is I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm mad, or I'm scared. Those are your basic emotions. But as your kids get older and they can get more granular about how they are feeling and how they can describe it, you might discover that within this, here we have surprise, right? So feeling surprise can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending, can be shock, it could be confusion, but look way up there in the corner at that awe. So one of over 80 human emotions, and yet there's really rich research just on this 3-letter word, awe. So tonight we're going to talk about 3 things. What is awe? Why seek awe? And where do we find it? So first, let's just define our terms so we know we're all on the same page. Awe is that feeling that we have when we encounter something that is vast, it's wonderful, it is beyond our ordinary frame of reference. That may be a bird in the middle of winter you've never heard before. That may be a piece of music that gives you goosebumps. It may be the pictures from NASA that come out that are just blowing your mind about how big this universe is. Awe very specifically evokes a sense of mystery and wonder. And this is my opinion, that given its documented benefits, I believe that awe might be our most overlooked and undervalued emotion. So when I think about my early encounters with awe, I think about my dad waking me up at 3 o'clock in the morning and taking me outside. He had laid out sleeping bags and snacks because it was the Perseid meteor shower in August and he didn't want us to miss it. I'm the youngest of 5. I'm going to guess only 1 or 2 of my siblings made it out with me. But I remember being under those stars at age 9 or 10 and watching these streaks of light going across the sky and just feeling this sense of wonder at what I was seeing. My daughter came back from her first sleepaway camp this summer. She went for just a week, and like any new experience, it had its ups and downs. But the one thing she told me in a hush one night was that on their very last night, the counselors took them out to the tennis courts and they laid out on their sleeping bags and they just looked at the stars. So, as Dr. Keltner, who is the founder of the Greater Good Science Center, told me, don't underestimate the power of goosebumps. So why seek it? What are these benefits I'm talking about? So there are 3 basic categories of why this is so good for us and our kids. First, awe benefits academic motivation. So if you're here for that academic piece, there's a correlation between awe and academic achievement. There's a very strong correlation between awe, mental health, and emotional well-being. And it also is good for community. It is good for our connectivity. It is good for our character. It helps us become more generous. So I want to go through those with a little more specificity before I get to the really fun part of the evening, where I'm going to take you through some of these sources of awe. So first, awe sparks curiosity. Now, the average 4-year-old, if you have a young one, asks about 73 questions a day. That may seem on the low side to you if you have a 4-year-old at home. And while that can be trying on our patients, it's really the superpower of our kids when they start to get interested in something, because curiosity is the driver of internal motivation. This is why a kid who sees his or her first dinosaur fossil suddenly is memorizing the names of every single dinosaur. What is prompting them to inhale this information? It's their curiosity. I took my son to his very first baseball game at Fenway Park about a year ago. And over the intervening year, he has become a repository of all things Fenway Park and Red Sox, because being in that place, cheering with others, it sparked something in him that really created this sense of curiosity. So just to take one piece of research, out of a study of more than 400 high schoolers, they found that the more awe that students reported feeling, the more curiosity they then expressed, and the better they performed in school, because they were doing it for the right reasons. They were searching it out because they cared. Awe boosts gratitude and emotional wellness. This is one of those pieces of research that is going to change some of your lives in this room listening to this right now. And it comes actually from a study of elderly individuals, specifically those in early stages of Alzheimer's and experiencing cognitive decline. And they asked them to take a 15-minute awe walk each week. And an awe walk is really just defined as walking around, getting out of your head and noticing. So instead of turning inward with your headphones, noticing the leaves, noticing the clouds, noticing the bird songs, paying attention to these things in the natural world that naturally provoke awe. So consciously being outward. And what they found and replicated was really exciting, that older adults who took weekly 15-minute awe walks reported increased positive emotions and less distress in their daily lives. This is something I started doing last year. So a couple times a week on my morning walk, I literally call it in my head, I'm going on an awe walk, which means my phone is on silence. I might have my dog with me, but I'm actively noticing how the seasons are changing. I am pausing to look at the brook near my house and just, what do I see there? This has become a cherished ritual and part of my day, and I drag my kids on these walks too. Awe-inspiring generosity and helpfulness. This is another fantastic study out of Berkeley. And since you are all in the Bay Area, you might notice these two pictures. They're grainy because I took them directly from the study itself. They had students on Berkeley campus stand in the same spot, but they changed the direction they were facing. So they either faced the back of a building, as you see there on the right, or they faced a grove of old growth trees. And after spending 10 minutes just staring, they weren't told why, they were staring at these things. Somebody, an actor, part of the study, walked by holding some pencils, and they stumbled, they tripped, they dropped what they were carrying. And they simply noted, did the person stop to help the stranger pick up the pencils? And those who'd been staring at the trees were significantly more likely to help a stranger than those who stared at a building. Now, that's research I find awe-inspiring because it provokes for me more questions than answers. What is it about staring at trees that makes us more responsive and in tune to a stranger on our path? I had a chance to speak to Dr. Craig Anderson, who is a professor of psychology, but he did his graduate work at Berkeley. And as part of that work, he took 19 different groups on whitewater rafting trips in California. He took groups of combat veterans diagnosed with PTSD, and he took teenagers who were in areas that had experienced community violence, who, as he said, had higher levels of PTSD than did the combat veterans in aggregate. What he found in his research is that 6 weeks and 6 months later, those who had engaged in this trip and very consciously been together experiencing this awe of nature, this collectiveness together, their PTSD symptoms had decreased in comparison to a control group. And so one of the things that Dr. Anderson has really been so interested in is how do we make this experiences with awe and nature, a concurrent, a complementary intervention in addition to the other ways that we work with our kids who are dealing with various forms of trauma. And finally, this is a new one for me that I just came across a couple of weeks ago. Awe reduces our mental chatter by boosting humility. What do we mean by mental chatter? So I recently interviewed Dr. Ethan Kross, who is the author of Chatter, The Voices in Our Head, Why They Matter and How to Harness Them, something like that. But he's a neuroscientist who focuses on those voices in our head that are constantly reminding us what we haven't done, what we said this morning that is still, I can't believe I said that. I can't believe my partner and I had this fight. It's that loudness as we try to fall asleep that we wish we could turn off. And in his research on ways to kind of tone down the chatter, one of the ways he focuses on his book is experiences with awe. And this is a story he told about it, how this worked in his life recently, that he had had a little fight with his teenage daughter about not cleaning up the living room. And, you know, never feels good to have conflict with your kids. And so he was having a lot of mental chatter about it. And that same day, NASA released their pictures from the telescope, the one I had on the very first slide. And he said he looked at those pictures and realized every dot was a galaxy. And he said, every dot's a galaxy, the state of my living room here on Earth. And it just centered and calmed down. It helped him zoom out and realize that whatever he was wrestling with, it helped him put it in perspective. And I think we've all had those moments where we're so upset about something, but then we talk to a friend who's wrestling with something, and then things begin to put in perspective and you realize maybe I don't need to worry so much about this. I need to kind of refocus on other things. These two pictures are from 2 different seasons in Massachusetts where I live, and both of one of my children, because I think these moments where in a storm and by an ocean, if you need that reminder that we are in fact quite small in the scheme of things, Mother Nature is really a great source of that. So to sum up the benefits, I'm going to turn back to something Dr. Keltner told me. And that is that awe makes us curious rather than judgmental. It makes us collaborative. It makes us humble, sharing, and altruistic. And it quiets the ego, so you're not thinking as much about yourself. So that's a crash course in the science of awe. And during Q&A, if you want me to speak more about any of those, I'm happy to dive back in. But I want to do something a little bit different right now. There are 8 basic places that humans identify as major ways that they find awe. And our brains aren't, unless you're taking notes, you're not going to remember all 8 of these. So I'm hoping to make this a little interactive so you can interact with the screen to kind of show you, almost to mimic awe with what's on the computer screen. And try to find just 1 or 2 that you feel like you could integrate into your family life just a little bit more as an experiment. So where is awe found? What are the 8 sources of awe that researchers have identified? The first one is the one we've talked most about so far, that might feel like the most obvious, and that is nature. Now, there have been a lot of amazing books and articles written about nature bathing, the emotional benefits of green space, the mental health benefits of green space, why this is actually a social justice issue when you have especially city areas where the density of trees is so much reduced, because being in nature, aside from everything else, has the mental health benefits that come from those quiet moments of awe where you stop and you see the woodpecker, where you stop and listen to the brook. And it may feel like, you may have a kid who loves being outside, but I think sometimes we get so focused on school and sports and screens that we may find that we're not necessarily taking these walks or purposely finding this time to go in nature. And I was feeling that last fall, shortly after diving into this research. So I dragged my kids to a local Audubon center. They did not go willingly. And, they want to know when they could leave, how quickly. We got there, we're walking around, they're grumbling. But then we started to spot some snapping turtles, and then there was a heron. And we got about 30 minutes into this walk. And my tween turned to me and said, "Next time I don't want to come here, can you remind me of the feeling I'm having right now?" That feeling is awe. And sometimes we have to take ourselves there kicking and screaming to get back there and to reset. So that's number 1. Number 1 is nature. So think about spaces near you that are rejuvenating, that can bring that sense of awe. Number 2 is music. I think we've all had those moments where we hear a piece of music and we just get those goosebumps that Dr. Keltner talks about. And it may be a different piece for different people. It will be. That's the great thing. But there's something about the way the chords align. Yo-Yo Ma, during kind of the height of things, was putting out regular Twitter videos. And he dedicated this one to the healthcare workers who are doing the impossible every day. And I clicked on it, I listened to it, and I suddenly found myself transported and in tears. I'm going to click on it just in case this piece does something similar for some of you. It's about a 2-minute sound clip. Thank you. So I went to Twitter after I experienced this to see if anybody else was having the same visceral experience I was. And I came across dozens of people. I just grabbed a screenshot of a few. One of my favorite, Dvorak, number 9, second movement. I wanted to hear this in a while, but never expected him to play it. I don't know why I'm crying. Yo-Yo Ma's music leaves me speechless, but not tearless. Serious question. What is it about music? What happens in our bodies when we listen to a cello or any music that will make us stop like a deer in a glen? And why am I weeping in my kitchen at 6 a.m.? I had a similar experience to this. I know NPR calls these, driveway moments, where somebody had posted on a social media, I just pulled into the driveway. Oh, Joni Mitchell is at the Newport Folk Fest, surprise, singing Both Sides Now. And suddenly I click, and there is a very elderly Joni Mitchell with Brandi Carlile singing Both Sides Now on the other side from when she had first recorded this as a 30-year-old. And there I sat for whatever reason, that mystery, right? Wondrous mystery, crying in the driveway, just grateful to be hearing her voice. Number 3 is art. One of the things I realized with the pandemic was that I hadn't taken my kids to an art museum in their memory. I had taken them as a kid quite a bit when, kind of those early days, but it had been a while and they hadn't remembered going. So I took them to 2 last year. And we went to the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, and that's where the statue of the Buddha is. And we went to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, where this other painting is. And inspired by this research, I played a bit of a game and I said, all right, here we are in this gallery. Find one piece of art that just speaks to you and you don't know why, but you look at it and you're like, wow, find me your wow piece. And these are 2 pieces that my kids identified as their wow pieces. This statue of a Buddha looks to me like a river. And then this wondrous piece, this is the expulsion from the garden. So you have kind of the world and the volcano and Eden on one side. And after a bit, my kids looked and noticed that there are actually 2 characters. Like there's an Adam and Eve in there somewhere, but they're so tiny. Like what a beautiful depiction of awe, because the human is really not even there. It is this vast and wondrous world being depicted. Number 4 is spiritual practice. And it didn't matter which tradition, formal religion or not, but spiritual practice inherently is something that is seeking out mystery. It is connecting us to something larger than ourselves. It is something that is done in collaboration, often with others, or if it's by ourselves, we know we are following traditions that have been done before us and that link us. And so, for those who do have a spiritual tradition, this can be a way for you or for your kids, if it works for you, to feel and explore that sense of wonder and awe. And what I find often is, if it's not something that maybe you grew up with but fits anymore, that sometimes finding meaningful rituals, family rituals that you can make, even if it's something like we did for years when my kids were small, which was we had a gratitude jar where every day we went around the table and we dropped a pebble in for something that day that had brought us joy that we're grateful for, however big or small. And that became a ritual, a form of spiritual practice for our family that we dropped out of doing when we moved a few years ago. And then recently my kids found the jar and brought back all these memories of sitting around nightly doing this ritual that was connective. Number 5 is a term you may not know because it's not a really particularly common term. It's called collective effervescence. And yet it is one of the things that I think we missed so much, and that our kids, if you had teenagers during the pandemic, they missed so much. And collective effervescence, I want you to think of the wave at a stadium, right? Where suddenly, almost out of nowhere, the hands go up and then it keeps going around and we're not quite sure who started, but we all know what to do. Collective effervescence is when a group of people seems to speak and act as one. And you feel that sense of collective and that bubbling up, that joy that comes from being a part of a group that is synchronous, that is doing it together. So if you've ever been in a choir or orchestra and experienced making music together, that can do it. You know, when you go to, say, the baseball game, which is on my mind, and suddenly a home run is struck and it's instinctive. Everybody rises up and throws their hands in the air and you're high-fiving strangers. It's like we all know that ritual that we stand up and throw our hands in the air. This is why team sports can be just so valuable for kids. And, you know, I'll even speak to that. I have one of my kids who really doesn't like sports at all, but I wanted them to be moving their bodies. So we decided to try out something different and decided to try out cross country and track because it's not competitive and it's not about following rules. It's very simple. You just run. And she loved the first practice last week because she said, I went there and there were 200 kids and they were all just running. And there was something about the group energy of being able to do something together. We were all running the same direction and having that experience. That's collective effervescence. This is the thing. This is the reason why I feel it's so important for whatever it is for your teenagers to find that club, to find that really good social outlet, because kids crave this one so much that they're going to find it. If they don't find it in healthy ways, they're going to find it in destructive ways. They're going to find it. And I'm not saying online video games are necessarily destructive, but they're going to seek out. They might even seek out. I look at the number of boys being groomed right now for kind of white nationalism, and it's playing into this desire to be part of something big. And so it's playing on those very real, very primal desires to be part of this group. And so finding healthy ways to channel that is a really, really important thing for us as parents. That's a whole other side presentation, but I want to throw that out, that anytime you see a kid being pulled off direction that doesn't feel healthy to you, it's that desire to be part of this collective effervescence that's so entrancing. And if we can find ways to do that in healthier spaces, we're giving them a gift. Number 6 is a really interesting one, and any scholars in the group will appreciate this. Big ideas are a source of awe. I mean, can you remember the first book you read that just made you sit up and be sad that it ended? Like, I can't believe this book just ended, or it just changed your way of thinking. Think about those New York Times lists of most influential books, right? Or you had a teacher who just opened your mind up to a new way of seeing calculus or philosophy or English or mathematics, and it was beautiful. I put on 3 things here that inspire awe in me, which is Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. He is a psychotherapist who endured the concentration camps and wrote beautifully, post-it about how to find meaning in the bleakest of times. Collective response to Amanda Gorman's inaugural poem, and this reminder that poetry is something that is awe-inspiring, that provokes wonder. And right now I'm in the middle of reading Braiding Sweetgrass about indigenous wisdom of botany, and it is opening up my mind in new ways, and gratitude for our interactions with nature and wisdom that that I feel like I still need to gain. Number 7. Number 7 is encountering life and death. Obviously, these beginnings and these endings are tremendous sources of awe. And I'll remind you, as Dr. Kirk Anderson reminded me, that we like to focus on the awe-filled, the things that fill us up, but we can also find awe in the awful, right? The moment where something is so big, like the storm that is coming, that it makes us feel small, but in a way that's very vulnerable. But encountering life and death does make us vulnerable, but it's also can be a time of such beauty. And I picked these two pictures because this was a very compressed 4 years in my life where I said goodbye to my father and then subsequently had my two children who he did not get to meet. And I often think about the lessons, the wisdom, the growth that happened in that saying goodbye and saying hello, the way I was changed forever by being a parent, and the way I was changed forever by saying goodbye to a parent, in my mind, much too early. I recently, we had to say goodbye to a good friend of mine who passed away much too early from cancer. And mixed within this grief, as friends from all walks of life got together on social media at the funeral to speak of the amazing ways that she had changed us, was one of those moments of profound awe for me, that this one person could have had such a ripple effect and touched us all in so many ways. And you know, sometimes I think we try to shelter our kids from the death part. The life part, if you have a teenager who's being surly, find a baby that you can like borrow from a friend and put that baby in your teenager's arms. That sense of awe will take over and they will automatically start smiling and rocking. We sometimes try to protect them from seeing the other. Death is something that's become very removed in our society, right? It often happens behind closed doors and away from children. And I think this ability to talk openly and keep the person who died very present and talk about the difference their life had made and make room at the table still for the memory of the people who have passed. You know, my kids said goodbye to two grandparents during the pandemic. And, you know, we consciously speak so much about their two grandparents, and to try to keep those memories alive and to make that a piece of them, because part of this tremendous awe is that we're all temporary, but we can all make such a ripple in this world in this time that we have. Which brings me to number 8, because when researchers asked, where do you experience awe in your life? It was not nature or art or music or collective effervescence. It was none of those that was number 1. The number 1 way that people experienced awe was in noticing the goodness of others. It was in seeing somebody step outside of their comfort zone to help a stranger. It was in those awe-inspiring moments where somebody made the call at just the right time, when you really needed that phone call and somehow your friend, your family member knew. This photo last spring when Russia invaded Ukraine, my way of dealing with things like this with my kids is they're going to hear about it anyway. I'd rather they hear about it from me. So we pulled out a map. We talked age appropriately, but honestly about what was happening. But I'm also always keep in mind Fred Rogers, where he said, when scary things happen in the world, let's look, this is an opportunity to point kids toward the people who are helping, because there is no tragedy, there is no difficulty where you're not going to find people stepping up. That's a great thing about humans. And so when my kids came home from school the day after I had told them what was happening, this is the picture I found to show them. And this is a picture from a Polish train station. And, you know, there were mothers fleeing with their babies. Pictures were all in the news, coming to Poland, and Polish mothers were leaving their strollers at the train station because that's something they could do. And so these are strollers that were left for the refugees who were flooding in. Goodness of others. So how do we find awe? According to Dr. Keltner, the lead researcher on so much of this work. This is what he told me when I interviewed him last fall. How do you find awe? You allow unstructured time. How do you find awe? You wander. You drift through. You take a walk with no aim. How do you find awe? You slow things down. You allow for mystery and open questions rather than test-driven answers. You allow people to engage in dance and visual art and music. And finally, because poetry has been a source of awe for me since I was a small child, and I can't tell you why I gravitated toward it, but it's continued to be a source of awe for me. I'll leave you with this, and I'm going to open up to questions. I'm curious what you have to say. Do not ask your children to strive for extraordinary lives. Such striving may seem admirable, but it is the way of foolishness. Help them instead to find the wonder and marvel of an ordinary life. Show them the joy of tasting tomatoes, apples, and pears. Show them how to cry when pets and people die. Show them the infinite pleasure in the touch of a hand, and make the ordinary come alive for them. The extraordinary will take care of itself. That's William Martin from The Parents' Tao Te Ching. So with that crash course in one of my favorite topics, I want to open up to see, what is it with covering all of this you may want to hear some more about. So Charlene, help me out here.
Oh, my new favorite thing are these emojis. I swear to God. Thank you, everybody. It's just beautiful. Deborah, you really brought us to such a special place. And that poem was wonderful. I think about, I'm half Canadian. So for me, watching, the extraordinary funeral planning for Queen Elizabeth, that again, that effervescence and awe, even at something that's sad, that even her hearse was lit from within so that people could take part in it and stay with her. I just love that. So again, thank you for a really wonderful presentation. All right, everybody, we want to hear from you. So you have questions, please do put them in the Q&A. We have some questions that are come in before, so I'll start with those. But again, questions, anybody? Here's one, Deborah. We know that being in nature is a great way to encourage a sense of awe. How do you suggest city kids get the same experience?
I think it has to be more purposeful. I mean, it's, some kids are gonna, I laugh because, I've lived in both, and right now I'm in a more suburban area, but I found that when I lived in Boston, I sometimes actually sought it out more intentionally than I did for many years of more rural living, because I was eager for it. And so I found all the green spaces. I used to go to the courtyard of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. I would walk along the public gardens. I'd walk on the Esplanade. I have a sister who's lived in New York City for 25 years. She does her walk on the High Line. She does her walks, in Central Park. I have a brother who lives in Philly, and he purposefully, he lives in Philly, works at UPenn, and he has planned his route to drop his daughter off. And I went with him the other day when I was visiting him, and he has picked every street that has the trees because he knows, he's an environmental scientist, and he just knows those trees are important. And so he's very purposefully choosing how he walks. And it's funny because Ethan Cross, who I talked to, he's the chatter scientist. He said that this research has changed the way he walks to work, his route. The other thing that it's true that sometimes even pictures of art, of nature, have an effect as well. So, that screensaver, really finding that beautiful place that brought them joy over the summer. If you went somewhere, that can bring back a little of those feelings of awe, when you click on your screen.
Yeah, and for those of you who haven't seen it, there's an amazing website. I think it's called Views of the World, where you can click on, people have video cameras set up in their windows. You can be in France or Ukraine or Kenya and see where people are, and you can hear the rain falling. And anyway, it would be a great thing to share with kids if you didn't have a lot of nature at your disposal. Some great questions coming in. Christoph says, I guess you don't need to teach kids awe. They're naturally awful.
Yeah, we can sometimes we have to learn from them, honestly, right? Because often they're looking at the sidewalk crack dandelion and we're pulling them along, and they're finding that awe. And so sometimes it's actually just making space for it and in our driven, obviously, sometimes you have to get somewhere. You can't stop and look at every bug that they notice. But can we look at a couple more than we sometimes do?
That's right. If you've ever walked with a 2-year-old, you don't have to wonder what is interesting, right?
Yeah, they see awe everywhere. That's the thing about, I love to hang out with preschoolers because the world is wonderful, right? It's just a wonderful place. And that if you need personally, if you have a 4-year-old, it can be overwhelming, but like, if you've now passed that stage, like it's fun to go into a preschool. I find it completely rejuvenating to go into preschools and just get a dose.
100%. I spent 10 years with preschoolers because I loved it so much. 4-year-olds are perfect creatures. All right, here's a great question. My teenage son seems to really enjoy virtual activities like YouTube, gaming, Discord, more than doing these 8 things you mentioned.
Yeah.
What do you suggest we could do to change that?
So it's funny. I asked specifically this question because I knew the question would come up about things like social media and online to Dr. Keltner and Dr. Anderson. I asked them both when I interviewed them. What I loved is that they were not Luddites about it. They didn't, that alarmist of like, oh no, this is good, that is bad. Because I said, can we find awe on screens? And in fact, I think video games can be really awe-inspiring, right? If you're on there, the graphics are amazing. You're part of these worlds. This is where that collective effervescence, if that's their only experience with it though, without being in the physical. So recognize that it's feeding, it's highly attuned to be kind of addictive, these tech, but it's also feeding their desire to have awe. So I think sometimes if we as adults are just like, that's bad, and this is good, you lose kids. And one of the ways that Dr. Keltner talked about it was that screens can be often a gateway to awe. So maybe you see something on there, you hear a bit of music, and then you want to go and hear that music, somewhere else, or you find a person who's talking about something, it sparks your interest. And so I'd recommend getting really curious with your kid, what is exciting? Which of these activities does seem to be exciting them? And is there an entry point? But then there's also sometimes where if they've never experienced much with the art or the music, just planning, say like, all right, this is Saturday, we're into a family trip or a day trip and go and experience something new. Sometimes you just have to get them out of their comfort zone and go and see that, traveling interesting exhibit or hear that street performer. But it's a lot of give and take with kids. And if they sense that you're just anti-tech, it's not going to be a great collaboration with this. And so sometimes it's like, what can you use from this to push into the non-virtual world?
It's really true. My son, who is a young adult and a new dad, lives in Montana now because he loves nature so much. But as a high schooler, his favorite thing was Quest video games, where he would travel with people and they would do things together. So now I think that really was an awe-filled activity for him. I just didn't understand it.
Yeah.
Right. So listen to your kids, find out what they're doing and why they're doing it. Right.
Absolutely.
Ingrid says, couldn't city kids find awe in planting a seed and watching it grow? Yes, absolutely. Right.
Yeah. I think gardening is, there's great research on that, but watching anything grow, right? From the caterpillar to the seed to a small garden. One of my kids is suddenly really into succulents. And so she's been transplanting. Don't know where it came from. Sudden interest, but I think that desire to have things growing and even that plant on the table by the bedside, that there are lots of ways to bring green in that are, you never know where it's going to take kids, but looking for ways to bring green space in is really key.
All right, Deborah, here's a question that is not exactly on target, but you have so much experience as a developmentalist, I'll ask it. Parent says, thank you for the talk. Not sure if my question is related. My 7-year-old daughter is scared of lots of things in nature, like earthquakes and car accidents and bad things happening. Just a lot of worries. Not sure how to help her. Do you have any suggestions?
Oh, yeah. That's an age where it's really normal to have a lot of worries because they're coming out of this kind of magical thinking. And suddenly, for example, death feels permanent, right? And so it's really common for a 6 and a 7-year-old to suddenly ask you all kinds of scary questions about death, or to develop nightmares that they weren't having the year before. And so, that can be a really challenging time for phobias and fears to emerge at in 1st and 2nd grade. That's actually a great reason to plan some of these outings to fill up the other side of it. Because, one of the major ideas around anxiety is that kids co-regulate their emotions with us, so that if they want to avoid it and we let them avoid it, then it says to them, oh, that really is scary because mom's avoiding it too. And avoidance then feeds anxiety, becomes the cycle. And so it may be that, that bug is scary, but all right, we'll walk right there, but let's look at this other cool butterfly. So you have that, you don't overreact, you help see something else. And over time, that can be diminished, partly because they're with you, realizing it's safe, and they're filling it with other safe memories.
Such a good point. Our friends Bill Stixert and Ned Johnson talk about being a non-anxious presence. And parents, I just think that is such a great message. Look them up. Dr. Bill Stixert and Ned Johnson, they have a new book called What Do You Say? That's really good to help parents through some of these tough times. Another good question. What research, if any, has been done to show the connection between screen time, particularly gaming, and diminishment of awe in children?
I don't know that there's been direct research. And again, when I asked these two in particular, they didn't point me toward any direct research there. I think, though, one of the things that one of them had shared was, and I think we're guilty of this too often as adults, and this is why awe walks are been so important for me, is that when I'm on, especially that little screen, it's an attention suck, and I'm not noticing those other things that are going on around me.
Right.
And so I don't have the opportunity to be surprised by awe, because awe is very often surprising emotion. We're not expecting to suddenly look up and be like, oh my gosh, the moon is gorgeous tonight. So, sometimes we can seek it out. We're like, all right, I'm going to, so-and-so to have this feeling, right? Like, I know that when I go to this concert, I'm going to feel this, right? We know it. But often awe surprises us. Suddenly we see somebody helping somebody else. We see something beautiful. We hear a piece of music. And if we're stuck to our screens, it's almost like a tunnel. And so we don't always have that opportunity to be surprised by the thing that will then fill us back up, if that makes sense.
It does. We did a wonderful presentation with the executive director of the design school at Stanford. And she talked about the same kind of thing, all walks, but instead it'd be like, focus on one thing. Maybe it's the color green. Maybe it's birdsong. Maybe it's the sound of water, whatever it is. And I think kids would get into that idea.
Yeah, and sometimes it's a matter of us helping them chase their interests, right? So I may say, oh, I'm going to have an experience of awe by taking them to this art museum, and then they're cranky, and then I'm thinking, you're not appreciating me. But, my son last winter, he was walking outside and he wanted to know what bird was making the sound. And so I downloaded this amazing app called Merlin. It's free. It's from the Cornell Ornithology Lab. And you hold it up and it will tell you what you're listening to. And whoa, that blew his mind, right? He's an 8-year-old, like this was. And so he would go outside, talk about screens being helpful with that. Yeah. He would take his iPad outside every morning and just like hold it up like an offering to the gods. And it's like, I heard a pileated woodpecker this morning. I heard a chickadee. And we began to trace the migration. And he had a question, we chased it. And it just became an opportunity to, pay attention to nature. So that's a great way that, sometimes technology can actually, wow, you're interested in that. Let's look it up. Let's find out where we can learn more about this. Let's find a class you can take on this. You really love manga art? Awesome. Let's find a program that you can use.
Someone wants to know the name of the app. Was it Merlin?
Called Merlin, yeah. And
Okay.
it's from Cornell Ornithology Lab. And you can do it by sight, by taking a picture, or sound, and it will tell you what you're hearing. It's like magic.
I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna do that
It's so
tomorrow.
good.
Little birds at my bird feeder. I don't know what they are. I love them, but I don't know what they are. Okay. So you mentioned that getting kids involved can be tricky. This parent asks or says, some children are just naturally more happy and joyful than others. What do you suggest for the glass half full kind of kid?
I love the glass half full kind of kid. I was a teacher for years, and those were always the ones I tried, because sometimes they actually are the ones who are seeing awe, but they're finding in such interesting ways. And so, sometimes these are the students, like when I'd be teaching English, that would find it in the dark poem, or they would find it in a compelling piece of music. And sometimes, there's a reason that sometimes our poets and philosophers, I think, can struggle with some of the darker emotions, and yet they wove it into beauty. And so I think we want to make sure that we're not trying to be like, why can't you be happier and more grateful? But, sometimes be like, wow, what poem I think you'd like, or what music, or again, follow the child, see what's interesting them. Because sometimes, once we're all going to feel this, this is a basic human emotion, and paying attention to when we do feel it. And then that can teach us about ourselves in really interesting ways.
It's so true, Deborah. We talked about Susan Cain's new book, Bittersweet.
Oh, I love that book.
Some of us tend to be, even as a child, I remember being more of a bittersweet kid. I like serious memoirs. I was 8 years old reading about Winston Churchill. Why? I don't know. That kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean? And if you haven't read that book, it's a beautiful one, and she speaks very much to one of those beautiful human emotions is poignancy, that just feeling, right? And it is this kind of temporariness, this state that it can actually bring these feelings of awe when you recognize. One of my favorite quotes is Susan David, who's a close friend of hers and a friend of mine as well. She's a psychologist, and she says that life's beauty is inseparable from its fragility, that it is, is because life is fragile that it is so beautiful. And those are the moments.
Right? It's like when we read Silent Spring as a teenager, it changes everything, right? Mm-hmm. Well, Deborah, the question that I like to end with, and maybe this is kind of a silly question for someone who just talked about awe, but I will ask you anyway, because I think it's relevant. And that is, what gives you hope here in September 2022?
Spending time with kids and teenagers gives me tremendous hope. I actually gave a talk similar to this to a group of high school students last spring, and the student council president contacted me a couple days ago and said, awe is our theme for the year. And I look at what the world our kids are in that can feel awful, and yet I see their impetus toward justice and goodness and kindness. And I just feel like if you hang out with teens, maybe not always your own, but if you hang out with teens in general, I think it's hard to be discouraged. There's that expression, the kids are all right, but I do find tremendous hope in these kids.
We have a very purposeful generation right now, don't we?
Yeah, they've been shaped by this, for better and for worse. But I think a lot of them are going to make changes for the better, because they've been marked by something collectively. And I think collectively, I think there's going to be a lot of great things that come.
Absolutely. We used to think we would have to run grit camps, but I don't think we need to do that anymore, Deborah. Well, listen, I thank all of you who are with us tonight and all of your lovely comments. The video recording will be available soon. Some people want to rewatch it already. They want to share it with spouses and friends. So Deborah, thank you for a wonderful presentation. Always a pleasure to see you. And thank you everybody for being with us tonight. And take some time for awe, take some time to share with your kids. And again, it's all about the relationships, people. It goes by really fast with those kids. Thank you, Deborah Farmer Kris, for a great evening.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.